So I get tired of hearing myself talk from time to time, so I may ask you some questions as we proceed through the presentation. Anybody know who this gentleman is that is showing on the screen right now? What are you laughing at? Oh. Does anybody know who that is?
Einstein.
It's Albert Einstein, famous astrophysicist. And Albert Einstein had a famous or infamous saying, depending on your perception. He said that all of life can be reduced to a math equation. Of course, he made that famous with his general theory of relativity, E equals mc squared. Every first year agronomy student is introduced to this formula that we see on the actual screen here, and that is that yield is the product of G times M times E. And in this case, the G, the M, and the E stand for something. Genetics, management, and then the environment. And it's important for us to remember that these things change over time. For instance, genetics. I was reviewing some information earlier this week, just looking at average corn yields in 1930s through 1940s, prior to the hybridization of corn. The average yields were somewhere, a high yield was in the 50s. And the reason is all of that corn was planted in wide rows because we had to be able to get a horse down the rows. And then it was also hand harvested. We didn't have the mechanical technology in order to harvest. And so over time, with the advent of hybridization and then improvements in management technologies, we were able to push those numbers higher. As a matter of fact, 3 times higher in about 80 years. Management, we know that management has changed. As I said, there were different ways in which we would utilize and do different things. The subject of no-till was brought up. No-till has led to huge advancements, not necessarily in corn production across the area, but in the areas of the country that can actually grow a corn crop now. But what about the environment? If you think about the environment, we have a lot of control over those first two, don't we? We have multiple seed dealers that come to visit us, multiple seed companies. And so our genetic profile may be broad. There may be a wide scope of things that we have the ability to choose from. Our management strategies may be different. There may be organic, conventional, no-till, ridge-till, strip-till. There are all these different things. But what about when we have difficult to control scenarios, like things like this, drought, heat, disease, hail, cloudy days, those kinds of things. Anybody here, I know this picture is very difficult to see, but you ever seen corn sitting in saturated soils and it just looks puny, looks like it doesn't want to get up and go, just doesn't want to motivate, kind of, like a teenager getting out of bed in the morning. They just don't want to get moving. And the question is, what is actually going on with that crop? We know that it is obviously anaerobic, but why isn't it moving? And is there anything that we can do to actually change that situation? And so that's really what I want to at least begin talking about in this presentation is how can we employ strategies that actually mitigate or minimize the effect of the environment on our growing crop. And we obviously are going to focus on this idea of the relationship between soil nutrients and then the plant uptake. Ken and Dean have done a great job of setting the table and talking about the importance of biology and soil nutrition and all of these things. And so we want to sort of begin to fill in the details of how we go about that. And then Gary's going to go on and talk about some of the specific strategies that we might employ. We all know that when we look at a plant, there are multiple nutrients that go into making up that plant and making that plant what it is. A plant, when you see it in the field, is primarily made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Those are the sugars that make up the bulk of the dry matter. But if you look at the rest of the material, there are a bunch of nutrients that are forming all of those things. And we're going to look a little bit about what some of those nutrients are doing within the plant. And then we're going to pay particular attention to potassium as we sort of get to the end of what we're talking about. But really, for the first part of what we are talking about, it is this relationship between balancing soil nutrients and understanding the uptake of the plant and making sure that the plant has the nutrients that it needs. I have been an agricultural consultant now, for several years. And I can't tell you the number of times when a tissue sample would be taken and the tissue sample might come back being deficient in a particular nutrient. And the grower says, well, I applied that, let's just say phosphorus or let's say potassium. I applied that earlier in the year. And the mindset is, well, I put it in the ground, it ought to be in the plant. Not understanding that there is a relationship that has to occur in order for that to happen. And the end goal, the thing that we are trying to accomplish, is we want to make sure that the nutrients that are contained within our soils and our plants are adequate. That is, they are at high enough levels to achieve the things that we need to achieve and that they are balanced. There's been quite a bit of research recently that demonstrates that if we don't have balance, if we get, for instance, nitrogen too high, it has a suppressive effect on sulfur uptake, phosphorus uptake, so that it's really not the uptake, it's the utilization of those things. And so it's very important to have that balance. Let me put this in a bit of perspective. My doctor has told me I need to lose a little bit of weight. I pay him for him to tell me this. But he said one of the important things that you need to do is eat a balanced diet. You need to eat more vegetables. You need to, well, I love breads. I love cakes. I love pasta. I love those things. Well, guess what? If I eat too many of them, it's not good for me. And that is the same thing for a plant. If it is taken in too much, those things can actually become toxic to it or become suppressive in such a way that it is going to harm the yield. Anybody in here ever seen this chart before? Okay. Got a few people. This is called a Mulder's chart. And agronomists have used this for years to understand the relationship between nutrients, both in the soil and also in the plant. And basically, the way you read this, you have various nutrients around the outside. Where there is a green arrow linking these, so let's take, for instance, calcium. It's right there at the top. You can see there are quite a few green arrows going to different nutrients. And what that tells us is that calcium in the wrong form can be antagonistic to other nutrients in the soil. If you get too much of it in the soil, it is not going to allow those other nutrients to be available. It's going to occupy a bunch of parking spaces in the parking lot and not provide other nutrients to be available. And then the black lines are indicative of things that when they are in the plant, they actually are synergistic. They help the plant take up other nutrients. Why is this important? Well, when we realize all of the different functions that, and I realize you can't read this, I can get you any of these charts that you want. I have them saved on my computer. But I just want to take one here, since we're going to be focusing on potassium. It's right here in the middle. It is taken up as a positively charged ion, and it is its main role within the plant is osmotic and ionic regulation. Well, what does that mean? Osmotic, that is water pressure. Think of osmosis. When you have high pressure, things tend to flow to a lower pressure. The system is always trying to maintain balance within itself. And then, of course, ionic regulation. That is essentially our electrically charged nutrients that we're taking up. It is regulating those. And so when we understand these things, it helps us to then make some choices as to how we apply nutrients and what we do. And what we want to really focus on is the bridge between the soil and the plant, which Ken has already talked about. You're gonna hear more about it later from Dr. Heininger, and I'm just gonna touch on it briefly. Just wanted to throw these up here. I think it's very fascinating. I am a bit of a science nerd. I'm one of those people that read scientific studies just because I like to do it. There are some people that are like, I don't want to do that. I will actually sit at home on the weekend and scroll through and look at different scientific research, and I find that fascinating. Here's just a couple that I would share with you. Organic soil amendments improve soil health by increasing soil organic carbon content and have a direct or indirect effect on soil-borne pathogens. They can reduce or have a suppressive effect on diseases in soil pathogens by up to 45%. So what are we talking about? Things like manures and compost and things like that actually have a suppressive effect on disease. Talking with a couple of very, very smart guys, Reggie and Ken Anderson, last night. We were talking about the use of fungicides in our country. And we just get in this cycle of using fungicides to control diseases. And much of the answer, according to these studies, there's multiple there, about half of the issue is in the ground, the things that we can do to change that. And of course, biology, Ken alluded to this. Organic exudates of bacteria actually play a key role in releasing potassium and potassium-bearing minerals. And then finally, calcium. Ken Anderson is going to talk about the role of calcium. Ken's already alluded to it, its role in flocculation in the soil. So we have these three hallmarks, the organic carbon, the biology, and calcium in particular, that help us to achieve these things that we are trying to do. If you think about it, all of these nutrients, as we've talked about, are coming together in a balanced way to essentially do one thing, and that is to make energy. The plant is trying to make energy. It captures sunlight and it combines it with nutrients, and through a miraculous metabolic process, sugars are made, and that energy then eventually turns into the byproduct, which is the fruit, the grain. And I might just point out a little bit, one thing on this chart. I know you can't read this, but since we're talking about potassium, I'll just read some of these to you. Potassium increases resistance against pests in low temperatures. I am from Southwest Missouri. We grow a lot of wheat in Southwest Missouri. One of the number one pests we face every year is aphids. We battle them. And I wonder if we were just able to increase our potassium uptake, if we could limit the effect of some of those aphids on affecting our wheat and carrying different diseases. Potassium increases fruiting quality. Obviously, vegetables growers know that very well. It aids in transportation of nutrients. One of the reasons we can't get mobile nutrients to flow within the plant is we don't have enough potassium within the plant. We know that potassium promotes root health, but it also adds new roots. One of the unique ways that potassium works, it is mobile within the plant. It is taken in through the roots and it flows upward in the plant. If there is excess potassium, it is placed into the vascular structure of the plant, and then it translocates back down to the root, where it is used to make new root tissue. And what happens is, as you make new root tissue, that positively charged potassium ion is now no longer available, and now you have an imbalance. You have more potassium outside this new root than you have inside. And what happens when we have an imbalance? By osmosis, we want to move from an area of high concentration to the low concentration, so the potassium crosses over, and all of a sudden we have more potassium in the plant. That is going to become incredibly important about the thing we're going to talk about here soon. And so what we are really talking about is a positive feedback loop. And Dr. Heininger is going to explain this much better than I can. But basically, the idea is we have these soil nutrients, and those soil nutrients are taken up by our plant. And they are taken up and they produce energy. And the byproduct of that energy is metabolic waste. We call them exudates. And they come out through the root tissue. And what do those exudates do? Where did Ken go? Ken, what do those root exudates do? Feed microbes. Yes, they feed microbes. And then, Ken, what do microbes do in turn after they've been fed? They actually turn those release new soil nutrients so that the plant can take up nutrients. And all of a sudden, we have this cycle happening. That's one of the things that you will hear us talking about is increasing nutrient cycling so that we get this process happening very fast. So how do we monitor this positive feedback loop? Well, we take soil tests, we take tissue tests, we take sap analysis tests, and we do that so that then we can apply the right source of fertilizer at the optimum rate, at the proper timing, and in the correct place. And we can do this not only prior to the season, but throughout the growing season. Through the use of foliars that we can do in a more efficient way. We can ban those fertilizer. And so essentially what we do is we create the perfect storm for this plant to not only survive, but to thrive. And what that enables it to do is in those tough situations, make energy. Now, the way in which it does it, there was Dean and I were having a conversation at one time. He was speaking to some very, very smart people, and they were talking about this potassium cycle. And our idea of potassium is that it pretty much, we put it in the soil, the plant takes it up. Yes, it's mobile in the plant, but once it gets put on the shelf in the plant where it needs to be, that's the end of it. And what some new research is beginning to indicate is that is an improper understanding of how potassium actually works and acts within the plant. It is actually much more mobile and cyclical in the plant, and it can serve as a backup generator, if you will, in a plant. There was a great, I believe this was, I can't remember when this happened, but remember when everyone was going around buying generators because there was down south, there was that big ice storm and people in Texas didn't have power. And so everyone was buying generators, household backup generators. Well, potassium can actually act as a battery, if you will, a energy source when the plant finds itself in a condition of what we would call low energy. And what do we mean by low energy? Well, we're going to get to that in a minute. Let's start off, first of all, just thinking about potassium in general. We all know or have been familiar, or if you're not, you will be here in a second, the traditional potassium cycle. Essentially, potassium exists in the soil in one of three forms. It is either readily available in the soil water. This would be our soluble potassium that is readily available in soil solution, ready to be taken up, or it is trapped on a soil colloid. This is what we call the exchangeable portion. And so what happens is if we take one ion out of here, it's going to be replaced. Remember, balance. What the system is trying to maintain is balance. But we also have some that is in rocks and minerals, and that is unavailable to us. And that's where some of the biology can help. As we speed up this process, we actually quicken the process of these things moving from soil, rocks, and minerals into this soil colloid so that it can then be part of the exchange complex. But this new research has indicated that potassium, when it's loaded into the vascular tissue, does several things for us. As we take up this potassium out of the soil water and we get it into the plant, it can actually communicate new demand to the root zone and say, hey, I need more potassium, or oh, I'm good, I've got enough. Well, the question is, how does it do that? Did you ever play on one of these as a child? A seesaw, you know what I mean, a fulcrum. So when I was a child, my doctor didn't tell me I needed to lose weight. He told me I needed to gain weight. I was a little tiny, skinny little guy. And I remember one day very distinctly playing on one of these, and I got on it with a rather large child, about he was a year or two older than me. And I got on and I went up and I didn't come down. There was no balance there. And what happens when the plant takes up potassium, if it doesn't need it in order to make the things that it is making in the mitochondria, it will send those into the phloem tissue where they will just exist. Remember, as a positively charged ion, that's very important. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But it will exist there. And if the plant senses that, hey, I've got a bunch of potassium flowing in the phloem, I can tell the root, hey, don't need more potassium right now. It's okay. Don't take any more up. However, when that level gets low in the phloem, all of a sudden the plant can say, okay, I need more potassium. Just like when we get hungry about 11:30, 11:45, we're all going to be like, hey, it's time for lunch. The same thing is going to occur. Second thing that potassium can do within the plant is transport energy stored in the potassium gradient. Now, this is fancy scientific jargon, and I struggled and struggled to figure out how to explain this. And I finally got an idea. Have you ever played with magnets? Anybody awake out there? You ever played with magnets? When you pull them apart, what do you have to exert on that? Energy, effort, force, whatever. It's not like they give you throw them on the ground and come apart. They are attracted together because they're opposite polarity, right? Remember, how did I say that potassium was stored within the plant? What is the ionic charge on it? Is it positive or negative? Positive, very good. So sugar, does anybody have an idea of what sugar might be in the plant? What'd you say? What would it be, positive or negatively charged? Okay, negatively charged. And so when you pull up, or when potassium is flowing, it can actually attach to sugar. And this is the mechanism that we're going to discuss in just a little bit. I want to make sure that you keep in mind this idea of positive and negative. This magnetism is an incredible illustration to help us understand, in my opinion. Maybe you guys grasp this. I'm a little thick. I mean, I do read scientific studies, so I can't be that smart. But it is a good way of helping us to understand this mechanism. And finally, the last thing that this study showed to us is that potassium is regulated internally, not just externally. For a while, we thought, we get our base saturation high enough in soil solution, then we know that we are going to have ample potassium to be able to flow to the plant. Well, what this study indicated to us is that is not always the case. Sometimes we can have very low availability of potassium, and yet the plant can reuse the potassium that is stored within it to help itself in these what we're going to call low energy scenarios. Okay, so what are the conditions in which we might find ourselves in low energy? Or a fancy way of putting this, the way scientists explain this, is low ATP. ATP is the main energy molecule that the plant makes. Stands for adenosine triphosphate. And you do not have to be a soil chemist to understand how this works. I am not one. I don't claim to be. However, there's a couple things that we do understand. Essentially, we have nitrogen and phosphorus molecules attached using a sugar molecule. And remember, both nitrogen and phosphorus are negatively charged ions. And so these ATP molecules carry a net negative charge of negative 3.5 or 4, depending on exactly how they're constructed. It's two different versions of them, if you will. Remember, potassium is what type of ion? What's its charge? Positive. This is negative. These are just two magnets. Now, this has the ability to carry anywhere from 3 to 4 potassium ions with it. Or better yet, potassium has the ability to carry ATP molecules with it. And so if it moves, guess what's coming with it? Sugar's coming with it. And that's exactly what is happening. What are the conditions that would cause low adenosine triphosphate or ATP within a plant? Anybody have any guesses? When would a plant not be able to make energy? If the sun doesn't shine? What else? If it doesn't rain? Did somebody else say something? Cold soils? Yeah. What other type of soils? Wet soils, saturated soils, anaerobic soils. Those exact same conditions that we talked about earlier that are tough environmental conditions happen to be low ATP or low energy situations. The other one that we haven't talked about, excessive heat. Those of you in the north, I'm sure you see this from time to time. These are our summers down in southern Missouri. When we get above 90 degrees, most plants just don't want to do a whole lot. Neither do agronomists, but that's beside the point. These are anaerobic conditions, drought, disease with tissue loss, so tar spot or other types of diseases when it comes in can actually affect tissue. So if we lose the photosynthetic factory, we can't make energy. Hail with defoliation. Interestingly, we're in Iowa. I was not too far from here in 2019, and I got a phone call. I was up here for meetings. I worked for Stein, which is in Adel, Iowa, about 17, 18 miles, probably more than that, 20 miles northwest of here. And I got a phone call from one of the individuals who I worked with, and he said, Mike, is there any way you can come out and look at some corn? He said, I've got a grower that started harvesting, and our corn looked beautiful all year long. We thought 250, 280 bushel corn, and we're in there with the combine, and the stuff is, it's making 180, 190. After a lot of research, what we figured out, and Iowa State confirmed this, during grain fill, there were a lot of cloudy days here in central Iowa. And the corn plant just wasn't able to photosynthesize and shove a bunch of starch into those kernels and make grain. So the same number of kernels were there was little itty bitty tiny kernels. And so all of these conditions cause what we might define as low energy, low ATP. And that's where this potassium battery comes in. Here's the fundamental question that this study was seeking to answer. Can we use potassium as sort of a shot in the arm, an energy boost, a shot of coffee, Monster energy drink, whatever your particular illustration might be, to kick these plants in gear under these conditions? And what they found is that actually can be the case. So how does this work? As we talked about earlier, the plant stores potassium within the phloem of the plant. If you think of phloem, just think of straws. They are vascular bundles within the main stem or tissue of almost all living things, and they transport water, and water is carrying nutrients. And then once those nutrients are made into sugars and other energy stores for the plant, they are then carried to other tissues where they either go into the grain or they go into building new tissue like roots, leaves, those types of things. And so if you can see this illustration, this is an illustration of a phloem of phloem tissue. And there is a potassium ion here that is being moved from the xylem over to the phloem, And remember, it is positively charged. And what were the sugars? Negatively. So when they move, they're carrying sugars with them. And that sugars would then be carried into the plant, into the cell, where it is broken down and used however it needs to be. However, in low potassium situations, we don't have the upflow of potassium. If it's dry, we don't have a bunch of water carrying potassium. Well, the plant will store potassium in between the cells. And when it stores it in between and it grabs it, remember, we're pulling it away from those sugars and we're breaking those energy bonds. And all of a sudden, we have a jolt, if you will. And remember, I said earlier that what the plant is trying to do is maintain balance. And so when we lower the concentration of potassium that is in between the cells, now all of a sudden, even though we have very limited potassium in the xylem and the phloem, it's now higher than that is in between the cells. So what's going to happen when we have a high concentration of something and a low concentration of something? Seesaw, right? We want to move back to balance. And so that potassium will then move from the phloem into the intercellular wall, and we can maintain that balance. And so this keeps the intercellular fluids, potassium concentration low, triggering further potassium release from the phloem stream. You're saying, Mike, this is great, but I didn't come here to get a science lesson. How does this matter? How can we use this? I'm glad you asked. So here's how we can use this. All things that have already been talked about up to this point. We want to always make sure that we are doing the first things first, keeping the main things the main thing. So we want to maintain adequate and balanced nutrient levels. We're going to utilize soil tests and tissue tests to make sure that we're doing that. We're going to use carbon building amendments, biology, and calcium to make sure that we have as much nutrient availability as possible. However, when we get into these situations where energy is going to be difficult for us, we can utilize potassium to maintain plant nutrient uptake. We can make foliar applications with potassium, and I don't know where the Tenacity Ag guys are. Where are you sitting at? Oh, there you are. They had their drone back there in the back, and I'm kind of glad it's up here in the front. So we can utilize drone technology to fly on in saturated soil conditions to be able to give the plant a boost, a shot in the arm. Couple of things that we want to do, thinking about the 4R's, source, timing, placement, and rate. We want to avoid potassium chloride. That chloride component within the potassium, we want to avoid that at all costs if we can, because it has a deleterious negative effect when we're putting it on, particularly in foliar options. But we have other options. And sometimes if we're taking tissue analysis and we recognize we might be low in sulfur, gives us the opportunity to apply potassium sulfate and kind of kill two birds with one stone, as well as other micronutrients. We want to apply specifically during reproductive phases. That's when generally we are going to run out of most potassium that's just the way the environment works. Those are the drier times, hotter times. We have a lot of those things coalescing all at that same time. But we may find we need it earlier. We talked about saturated soils. We may need it at that time. Again, we talked about foliar. We can do this as a banded, a lay-by, a foliar application. And then the rate is always going to be determined by what our tissue test or our SAP analysis shows. And so as we proceed throughout the afternoon, you're going to hear multiple presenters who are going to talk about some of these different things and some of these different scenarios, as well as some of the different manners and products that we might be able to use on this. So with that, I am going to ask if there are any questions that you may have about this Science Lesson 101. There is a certain sense in which that is true. One of particularly plants, through root exploration is the greatest way in which they take up potassium. And so we think of root hairs and things like that, and the extensions of those, the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi that extend those root hairs. That energy is cyclical, searching for examining new areas within. So if we put a lot of potassium in one area, we do create lazy plants. The way that I like to think of this, my kids growing up, if I did everything for them, they didn't do a whole lot. And I think the same is very much true of our plants. If we make it too easy for them, then we sort of stifle that. But to say there is enough, that's going to depend very much on soil. Because there are some places. I forget who I was talking to recently. They were talking about, maybe it was you last night, when the places in the country they never apply potassium, and then I know other places where they have to apply potassium. Just because their soil levels are low. Yeah, Ben.
Just trying to put together the thought of the stress conditions or the low sugar production. Would there be cases where if the plant is in a stress situation with low sugar production and decreased potassium, would a potassium application make a difference on energy production?
Yeah, so what it's going to do, essentially, the plant is going to take potassium in foliarly. It will see it either as available potassium or as excess potassium, where it loads it then into the phloem, and then we get that battery effect, that charging effect, so it produces more energy. So particularly, I like to think of our stunted plants, that's why I put that picture up there, in saturated soil. I'm going to try and find a place that I can run a little bit of a test this year. And I'm not wishing for anybody to get really bad saturated soil, but seeing corn sitting like that and then maybe get a drone to fly over it and get some potassium on it and see if we can, charge that and show a difference that, hey, that paid huge dividends. So
is the additional energy coming from better photosynthetic efficiency? Or is it kind of pulled off reserve?
It is coming from stored. So you get ATP stored within the plant that then potassium will attach to. However, it won't move. You remember, I don't know if you recall, one of the very first charts that I put up there, it talked about that potassium is responsible for osmotic and ionic regulation within the plant. And so it's moving ions around the plant and helping things move. It's carrying sugars with it, ATP, the energy molecule. So if you don't have potassium, if you have low potassium, it can't grab the sugar and carry the sugar throughout the plant. And if you can't carry the sugar throughout the plant, there's no energy for the plant it's starving basically. And it can't produce energy in order to make more energy. And so that's what we're doing. By adding the potassium, we're actually taking advantage of existing ATP. Now, let me just give a little bit of a caveat. This is not a perfect cure. It is when we find ourselves in this limited window of high temperature, short-term drought, short-term saturated soils, if we stretch out to weeks into months, it's probably not going to be effective in those situations. Does that make sense? So, yeah. Yeah, Dean.
Years ago, our dealer in southern Indiana was raising dairy in southern Illinois, right down on Shaw's far south of Illinois. Again, raising dairy, hot, dry, in drought. We were on the farm and I was promoted to do some quarter feed and said, this is dry, nothing happened. The ring rector at the time encouraged him, go ahead and go up to 20 acres. And he did that probably a week before we got there. And the grass grew out, probably 4 or 5 times the growth. The soil was soft, where it can fully fed during that. So this time, I wonder if that's an example.
And I'll give you one more example. So multiple universities have demonstrated this, applying potassium to soybeans late in the season, R2, R3, as we begin to get pod development. Yields can be increased anywhere from 10 to 30% by that additional potassium at that time. And what they believe is happening is we're stirring energy production, which then is putting a whole lot more stuff into the beans. Incidentally, anybody have a guess how big of a yield component is bean size to overall yield? Does anybody know? You know, you get some beans at 2,800 seeds per pound versus 3,800. That the seed size is the number one factor and is about 35% of the yield component. So if we can just make big soybeans within the pod, even if they're just 3 bean soy pods versus 4 bean pods, oftentimes we can make more yield. So that's essentially what I think another idea about this. Any other questions? All right, thanks, Mike.